live edition of Revolutionary Voodoo, New Orleans Voodoo Secrets and Recipes. All is truly and indeed a blessing. If you can just see beyond the veils, for it is all just an illusion and a test, and one of the greatest divine mysteries of this life cycle. Come on in, welcome, come on in. All is a blessing. All is a blessing. Welcome, welcome. Peace and love, joy and prosperity. I don't know what's going on with IG, but it's all good here. All is a blessing. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Join me on Facebook. Join me on Twitter, Periscope. Join me on my EarthGam page. Join me on my Facebook page. Join me on my YouTube channel, Voodoo Tide. Welcome. You can also join me on Blog Talk Radio. All is truly and indeed a blessing. Welcome, welcome. Greetings, greetings. Welcome. All is a blessing. All is a blessing. I don't know what kind of greeting that is, but all is a blessing. Greetings and salutations. Welcome, welcome. Welcome. Peace and love, joy and prosperity. Greetings, greetings. Greetings. Broadcasting to you live from New Orleans, Louisiana, USA. All is a blessing. Welcome. And you can call me at 845-277-9143, 845-277-9143. And come back home to Mother Africa. Come back home to the root. Come back home to the foundation. Come back home to where it all began. All is a blessing. Welcome, welcome. Welcome, Morocco. Come on in. Greetings, greetings and salutations. All is a blessing. Just a slightly different orientation today. Welcome, welcome. Esuale Guana, Kosi Were, Awo Olo Uto Ne Iwo, Ada Afanbo Osi, Obatalami Ita Ne Iwo, Onilio Aban Eshu. Eshu is the respected elder who flogs, confronts, and uncovers fools. That one versed in mysteries uses truth to own you. He causes scatter to feed poverty. Obatala shakes rascals to have sacrifice. The owner of warnings is the one who is Eshu. Aboru, Aboye, Aboshishe, Ashe. May our Ebo reach our room. May our Ebo be accepted. May our Ebo allow what we desire to come to pass. And so we say, Ashe, Ashe, oh, Ashe. And for those who aren't sure, that's Yoruba. That's Yoruba. Divine, all blessed, peace and love, joy and prosperity, elevation, revelations, manifestation. You are now sitting live with the Divine Prince. Always in archive, but also in archive for your leisure and convenience. Here broadcasting now live with you all things spiritual, mystical, metaphysical, cosmic, evolutionary, revolutionary, healing, and holistic from a Pan-African hoodoo world spiritualist perspective. Understanding that all is truly and indeed a blessing. If you can just see beyond the veils, for it is all just an illusion and a test. One of the greatest divine mysteries of this life cycle. This is indeed my personal and constant prayer. It is my mantra, my affirmation, my reverberation, my reiteration, and it is indeed my ever-living reality. It's crucial to the very foundation of my inner standing. Not just my understanding, but my inner standing, my walk, my truth, my work, my demonstration along this divine, all blessed life path and journey. It is how I, the Divine Prince, make sense out of all that we're challenged with here in our daily existence on Mother, Father, Earth. And it is my personal place of empowerment, the place from where I begin, the place from where I realize and crystallize all my endeavors, understanding that ultimately I and I alone create and co-create my divine destiny, and I alone create and co-create my divine all-blessed reality. And so it is. Ashe. And count it all weather. Everything else is just weather. It's just weather. It's just the lightning, the thunder, the wind, the rain, the snow, the cold, the heat. It's just weather. And indeed, if you're blessed to live, if you're blessed, like my mama used to say, to get old, if you are blessed indeed to become an elder, because they're checking out now at 9, 10, 12, 15, 25. So indeed, if you are blessed to get old, blessed to become an elder, blessed to gain some age and some knowledge and some wisdom on you, by all means, you have an obligation to give it away. You got to give it away to keep it. You got to share it to keep it. It's not to be housed. It's not to be stored. It's like a talent out of your Old Testament. It's not to be buried in the ground. It's not to be covered over. It is to indeed be given away. And so I'm always grateful for the opportunity to be present here with you in multiple platforms. Of course, on Blog Talk Radio. And you can reach me now at area code 845-277-9143. 845-277-9143. Always be patient with me. Understand I have to move between one tab to another. I get talking. I'm not always looking at either the chat or the switchboard. So just be patient with me. Do press the number 1 on your telephone keypad if you indeed have a question, comment, or request. I'll be more than happy to respond to you here in this shared sacred space. And of course, I invite you to join me here now live, co-host on screen at the StreamYard.com. And it's scrolling just above the screen right now if you would like to indeed join me. Some of you already know what I want to talk about today. Some of you already know where I'm going with this today. And I'm grateful. Indeed, I'm grateful. I'm grateful for my regular participants. I'm also grateful for my new participants. And I say participants because this is not a space where I just lecture, though I will often do that. This is not a space where I just teach, though I will often do that. But this is also a space where I would like to think that practitioners are being born and reborn. Healers and qualified spiritualists are being created and recreated from within this space. And the foundation upon which is laid in this space. Let me say it again if I haven't said it before, which I know I have. That was a little shady. Let me say it again for those in the back. Let me say it again with clarity. This ain't about popularity. This has never been about popularity. From 2005, when I first showed up on the airwaves, when I first showed up in social media space, sharing this message, teaching from this platform, before some of you were born, before some of you were thinking about voodoo, before some of you were even concerned about voodoo. I remember when I first showed up here, one of the first questions I asked was, where are the voodoo temple? Where are the voodoo people at? Where are they gathering? Because see, this call on New Orleans is not new. this ancestral call that many of you are now feeling, experiencing, responding to, dreaming about, it's not new. It's not new. It's been written about. It's been fictionalized. It's been documented historically and in archive from every angle and perspective. So there's not a whole lot about this genre that's new, except for the present attention now given to it. Save for the popularized, trending attitude, if you will, in our culture. I'm very careful not to say all culture, because, you know, America's a little bit arrogant, the UK is a little bit arrogant, and we think the whole world think like us. The whole world is operating like us. But from a global perspective, by way of this www dot thing that we are all interconnected to, this internet, we now see a global trend from the run-on voodoo dolls a decade ago in China, so much so that they outlawed them, to the now present Orisha romance, the now present Black witchery that we all are sort of somehow connected to, willingly or not. We all have our connection to it. So this is not new. The interest in the hoodoo is not new. The interest in the wanga and the mojo is not new. And indeed, there will be things today that I will share about this beloved Marie Laveau that to my more erudite listener will not be new, but there will be much more that I share that absolutely will be new to you, will be unheard to you. And I've sort of been hinting at Toni Morrison and the Black Book, you know, in the last week or so, because this is, you know, one of the gifts that I received for my birthday was a copy, a hard copy of the Black Book. And it was interesting to me what is in that book that we ain't heard about yet, that ain't been popularized yet. And so it makes me wonder, you know, this was created in 1974. So it's been around a few decades. It's been around a minute. And so it makes me wonder, again, because we've discussed this here on the show, about where we get our information, the source of our information, particularly when we are talking about the indigenous people of Africa, who were forced here through the Middle Passage. So I'm going to share some things, of course, that are going to be, you know, right in line with what you know, what you've heard about, what's already been rumored about, not just New Orleans, but Marie Laveau and voodoo culture. I want to also introduce, you know, which should be a given to you, that voodoo absolutely existed in New Orleans, not only after Marie Laveau's historic presence, but very much before. Very much before. And for my veteran listeners, you've heard me say it's been here since the first one arrived. And if you want to look at hoodoo at its root, it was here when they got here. The indigenous people that they attempted to enslave were here when they got here and formed a symbiotic relationship, if you will. Sometimes aggressive, sometimes not so aggressive, our relationship to the indigenous people of this land. Let's be clear, we acknowledge the indigenous people, particularly in New Orleans, for their assistance in the swamp, for their assistance in that maroon culture that you've heard me talk about for many years, that's understated, that's not talked about enough, that's not discussed enough, that's not educated enough. We, the African descendants here in the US, are still thought to be somehow the weakest, the lowest, the most beguiled, the most victimized, the lower end of the food chain, still, when we talk about slavery. when we talk about maroon culture, when we talk about history, and it's real easy for us to conjure up, roots. I was a part of for television, underground. I was a part of for television, and the many more dramatic reproductions of our story. But let's be clear, it's prettied up. It's presented in a way that this audience will receive it. And so even in the telling, our story is still yet untold. And particularly our branch of traditional African-based religious systems and how they managed to survive in this wilderness, how they managed to survive in this Babylon and survive till this day, however beat up, abused, appropriated, bastardized. Indeed, the footprint still lives, still exists today. And I like to invoke, and I'm always not sure I'm pronouncing her name to the best of my ability, Ina Fretnick. I'm always, motivated by her journey to uncover the reality of who Marie Laveau was. Marie Laveau was a legend. And if you put her in context with history, what was going on before she was born, what was going on after she passed away, what was going on with voodoo before you knew who Marie Laveau was in voodoo, and indeed what went on long before her presence. Now we know that what Marie Laveau was said to know and understand came from those who came before her, those who were well known and documented to be operating in voodoo, hoodoo, conjure, and performance, because I'm going to talk a little bit about performance today. So frenemies, call up your neighbors. I'm going to talk about performance today too. So we know Marie Laveau, birthday's tomorrow, September 10th, 1796. 1796. Now, why is that important? Because the Haitian Revolution took place in 1791. 1791. So just 5 years earlier, you got this footprint now of Haitian revolutionaries, Haitian escaping, the violent outbreak of what's going on in Haiti, the revolution, and bringing that energy to the U.S. And that's where the crossroads of truth, fiction, and performance indeed began. Because prior to Marie Laveau, voodoo wasn't that big of a deal. Not that big of a deal. Oh, indeed, it was known. It was worldwide. People came from far and wide to get they foot fixed, to get their luck on, to get their relationship sort of cemented, if you will, through the various channels of hoodoo and voodoo as they were manifesting in the city at that time. But even then, and particularly then, early on, was there this battle, this competition between what belongs to us, what belongs to our ancestors, what do we do within this that we don't share with the world. And then there is that, and let's be clear, in many modern book authors, and I'm not going to call you all out by name, I just can't, but many modern book authors, I will be sharing links, however, bibliographies, links, all of that. But there are modern book authors who would indeed make Marie Laveau responsible for the performance element, the commercial element, for otherwise making voodoo more accessible outside our community. There are those who would argue that. There are those that would argue that Marie Laveau only presented what people wanted, what people desired, what people hoped for. And any real, legitimate reader with any kind of calendar behind them knows exactly what I'm talking about. People will want particular things. People will desire particular services. People will ask you for what they believe to be the answer to their fix, their problem, their solution, based on something they didn't see, they didn't heard, etc. And it's not always real. It's not always authentic. It's not always true to the cause. But now the floodgates of vending and market space have now been opened, according to the storytellers, according to the historians, under the guise of the stately beauty and magnificent figure of Marie Laveau. Her figure, her body shape was one of the things that is documented as part of the draw to who Marie Laveau was. So we have to examine who did the writing, who did the storytelling, from whose perspective was the documentation being made. And so we have to go back to a footprint of voodoo prior to Marie Laveau. And what did that look like? I've often shared the story of Congo Square from a lesser known perspective, and that is that your enslaved ancestors were not fed on Sundays. You didn't work on Sundays, they didn't feed you on Sundays. And so here, unique to New Orleans, we're given that opportunity to grow a little plot of beans, greens, what have you, share some of your extra resources, your extra baked goods, which led to vending, the praline man and the watermelon man and the praline lady. It led to us developing market space in Congo Square, along with the liberty, and I use the word liberty very loosely, to sort of drum and gather and dance kalinda and dance bambula and remember Conga, in Congo Square. And I say it every day, if we could count in Fan, if we can count in Akan, if we could count in Igbo, if we could count in Ewe, if you could do 1, 2, 3, 4 in Trois, then you could now do it, even under duress, in Spanish, in French, in Portuguese, in English. So the notion that somehow between the west coast of the great motherland and the arrival into this wickedness, and let's understand how the journey of the Middle Passage worked. You often didn't come straight from to here. We often had to pass through Brazil, Cuba, Jamaica. Some would say it was a breaking ground, a trying ground, because you had to be a particular type of slave in order to do cotton and some of the rougher crop work that we had here in Louisiana and Mississippi. But from the very beginning, now some would say that the first slaves arrived here in, I believe, 1690. Let me get my document in front of me, because I said I had information and I want to share that. I also have information in response to Hoodoo occultism's comments about infanticide and slave resistance. And I was able to pull up and access some documentation on that. Again, always outside of the US. Always outside Cuba, Brazil, Panama, but it gets much tougher when you are trying to pull up information specifically about us and particularly here in our experience, in our slave experience. Indeed, our value, our humanity, if you will, and the space, the given geographic space and the dimensions of the space did not afford us the communal forming that took place in Cuba that took place in Brazil, for instance, that took place even with Nanny of the Maroons and the Maroons in Jamaica. And so a great deal of what we attribute to Boi Coupee and somehow them getting access to a plant, an herb, a concoction, a spirit, a loa that fueled them forward to revolution, that had to be suppressed, that had to go underground to some degree here. It doesn't negate the many attempts to have slave revolts. And indeed, one of the biggest attempts at slave revolting, slave revolution happened here, not far from here in Louisiana. But we find that in terms of the voodoo itself, the ethnic, cultural practices and traditions, we then begin to develop things that could be hidden, things that could be tucked away, things that could even be carried from place to place. When we look at, let me share some of these links while I'm. My apologies, are y'all still with me, right? Okay. Uh, I don't know what just happened there, but okay, I'm back. We're all back. Yeah, we indeed had to tuck away what we know, what we understood. We had to play dumb in some cases. We had to act as if we didn't know in many cases, just for our own survival. And it didn't mean that we didn't know, it meant that we knew enough to keep our mouth shut. We knew enough that if we exposed the idea that we could count past a certain number, or that we could read, or that we had an understanding of the sky, or of the plant life that exists around us, it could mean execution for yourself and for those who may have been around you, or even exposed to you. So the idea of the person, greetings, Chief Bougie, with the knowledge, with the awareness, sort of being frowned upon, sort of being demonized in the community, goes all the way back to enslavement. It goes all the way back to a time when you protected your own best interests. So we know that what is written and documented about Marie Laveau's journey into voodoo did not come from her marrying a Haitian, did not come from her being exposed necessarily to Haitian refugees in particular. Dr. John Montanet was said to be from Senegal, may have passed through Haiti, but some documents say that he passed through Cuba on his way to Louisiana. So it is uncertain if he passed through one, the other, or even both, and had some exposure to both. I've often shared here in this space the, international port city that New Orleans has always been since its very inception. And so you had pirates coming along with your enslavers and your slave ships, along with your wealthy and those who could afford transport into this new world, into this new territory that's now, in the context of 1690, 1700 is being colonized. It's now being sort of robbed from the indigenous people and recreated first for the French, then for the Spanish, and then again for the French, and then eventually for the United States of America. So the archives, the documents talk about Dr. John Montanet, not Dr. John the musician, because I understand when you try and search Dr. John, if you don't have the right language, the right use of words, most of the time all you're going to get is Dr. John the magician, the musician. I've even seen somewhere where it had Dr. John Montanet's autobiography, but Dr. John the musician's photographs. So it's not made easy for you to understand, for you to comprehend. And I'm grateful for people like Denise Alvarado and her tireless efforts to document our culture and put it in a context in a way that we can access it and make sense of it and further read up on it and do further study. So there are many powerful things that are attributed to Dr. John, the one who is said to have taught Marie Laveau. Louise Martinet was said to have taught Marie Laveau what she knew about voodoo, what she knew about hoodoo, and how to put that together. I also said that I wanted to talk a little bit more about performance and the idea of taking the power out of voodoo from its early days here in the US and relegating it to a realm of performance. Dancers, drummers, quite possibly singers and chanters, but separate from the religious practice, the religious tradition itself. I found some documents that even go as far as to suggest that Dr. John said that he was just performing, that he said that, he wasn't doing real voodoo. For those of you who are familiar with Chicken Man, which is a little bit closer to our time, modern time, who also came from a foreign land, came to New Orleans, embraced New Orleans voodoo culture, tradition, and performance, and became well known here in the city of New Orleans. Uh, but again, some writers would try and suggest that even he claimed to only be performing, claimed to not be really operating in the realm of voodoo. So that question about real versus not real, performance versus authentic demonstration of voodoo has been around since the beginning. And I attribute that to the fear of uprising, to the fear of revolution. Let's be clear, the oppressors, problem with us demonstrating voodoo here had nothing to do with calling down your ancestors. It had everything to do with any sense of empowerment that would ultimately lead to revolution, that would ultimately lead to uprising. The telling of Haitian Revolution was bloody, horrific. Just imagine a 9/11. Just imagine a Civil War, World War, but in living color, dramatized in a way that was real and very, believable and understandable to the slave owners here in the American South, who still didn't want their lifestyles, disrupted, who still didn't want to have to change their economy, who still didn't want to have to change their way of being. And so these incoming, escaping Haitians, if you will, fleeing the revolution, told great, horrific stories about insurrection, slaves rising up under the behest of voodoo potions and voodoo spells and voodoo ceremonies. So what went from sort of a space, I want to say a sacred space in which we could gather and do our tradition in Congo Square, still became a space that allowed a outside audience to come in and sort of view us, almost like your animals at the local zoo, or almost like your Hottentot, which is a white supremacist word, and the demonstration of these women, South African women, in a museum in the UK, based solely on their body structure. So we know that there was a culture of people who came to see the performance, who came to witness the drumming and the singing and the merriment, of these African enslaved in Congo Square. But with the incoming refugees from the Haitian Revolution, the environment for us became even more toxic, even more political, even more negative. So the Haitians didn't do us a favor, by reinforcing the volatile nature of voodoo and its effect on the slave, but it created a much more intense environment for us to now have to live in, to now have to mask in, to now have to take our traditions indeed underground. And so there were many new laws written after the Haitian Revolution that greatly curtailed our movement, our freedom, our liberties, if you will, to prevent any idea of our coming together, gathering together, getting on any kind of unified format that could even smell of interaction, that could even smell of a slave uprising. So the Haitian Revolution didn't do voodoo in New Orleans any favors. It indeed created an environment much more egregious than the one that we were already existing in. And so voodoo went underground. And so the idea of hoodoo and voodoo was then introduced at that time. I want to say during the time of the practitioner who followed Marie Laveau was said to have been given sort of the voodoo crown behind Marie Laveau was Santi Dede. And so I would suggest that it was not just during Marie Jr. or Marie Laveau's daughter's time that we saw this shift in how we view voodoo from a religious, cultural, ethnical perspective to one of war and revolution, and the introduction of witchcraft and more negative connotations about voodoo and what voodoo is. Now, of course, before the show, I had all of this laid out in order. So now I'm having to, and I might just be going backwards in my order. So I'm going to first share with you, if you'll just give me a moment, I'm going to share some documents. I'm going to share some videos. We're going to go a little bit into this today. So first, we want to talk about who came here and when. Who came here and when and how. Now, people have a problem with Wikipedia. I have a problem with Wikipedia when the information is not correct. I have a problem with Wikipedia when there's nothing to cite. When it says citation needed, like right here. That's problematic. But when we can take the information and then do further research and then go a little bit further into our look, I don't have a problem with what can be accessed in Wikipedia. So when we look at the French rule, 1699 to 1763, understanding the Haitian Revolution, because that's where people want to sort of anchor voodoo in New Orleans to. The Haitian Revolution was in 1791. Chattel slavery was introduced by French colonists in Louisiana in 1706 when they made raids on the Chichima settlements, those indigenous people that I talked about earlier in the show, who they originally tried to enslave, and it was just not successful for them. Thousands of indigenous people were killed, and the surviving women and children were taken as slaves. The enslavement of natives, including the Atacapa, the Bayou Gula, the Natchez, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Tansa, the Alabamon people, would continue through the history of French rule. It just was not successful. And we understand that at some point, there very well may have been the enslavement of Africans by indigenous people, but also the marrying into indigenous ethnic communities, having children within these new, now mixed ethnic communities. And so that's where the research, the DNA, getting the blood work is really important. It's one thing to say you look like a certain people, you look like a certain ethnic group. it's a whole nother thing to have that DNA backup. So the Native American people sometimes made slaves and enemies of these captured, enslaved people, but we also know that they brought them into their tribes, brought them into uh, their families by way of marriage and childbirth. While it's in my face, I also want to share this Emphasized document that I promised you yesterday that I would try and pull up some documents in terms of enslaved women killing their babies to prevent them from going into enslavement. So here we have an article and a document emphasized as slave resistance, evidence from Barbados, Jamaica, and Santo Domingo, which is what Haiti was once upon a time called. This document was uploaded and produced to Inquiries Journal, Social Sciences, Art, and Humanities, 2014, Volume 6, number 4, I believe page 1 and 2. And it talks about colonial era fictional and non-fictional descriptions of slave motherhood, offer conflicting accounts of the attitudes of slave mothers towards their children. While abolitionists tended to portray slave mothers as wholly selfish, doting, maternal, post-slavery writers describe slave mothers as negligent and cruel. The debate over the nature of slave motherhood was especially relevant to the Caribbean, where brutal working conditions, disease, malnutrition impeded slave reproduction. Plantation owners blamed slave women for their failure to reproduce, accusing them of practicing birth control and procuring abortions. In some cases, planters accused slave women of committing infanticide. And we know that this absolutely happened, but we know it didn't happen all the time and it didn't happen regularly. We also have to go back to my earlier statement about the varying differences between the geographical environment in which our ancestors of Barbados, Jamaica, Santo Domingo existed in, even Brazil, in comparison to what we existed under here in the U.S. Indeed, the killing of a baby could have been a really ugly thing on a plantation. And anyone who would have known, who would have witnessed, who could have bared witness to such an event could have also put their own life at risk. The value of the slave was indeed more importance to the slave owner than the slave itself. And so hoodoo occultism, I don't know if you're in the room yet or not, but yeah, we got some documentations indeed about infanticide happening and occurring here in the West, and not just south of the border, not just in Santo Domingo, Jamaica, and Barbados. But this is a great place to start. Many times these documents have their own book lists or links to further study, further exploration. For instance, there's a link here to Nat Turner and the Bloodiest Slave Rebellion. There's a link here to Reliving American Slavery in 12 Years a Slave, which was also filmed here. There's another article here, historic article here that links back to breaking the cycle of violence, control, and resistance in the American slave narrative, and how that continues to play on and have a role, have an effect on us, even still today. So I'm going to post that on my Facebook to make it easier for you to find it, to Hoodoo Occultism or anyone else who might be interested in further study on that particular topic. And let's see. I also want to talk a little bit more about Marie Laveau. Again, it is Marie Laveau's birthday tomorrow, September 10th, and its relationship to tourism, commercialization, some would say to some degree appropriation of voodoo culture, and taking it outside our community. And again, when we look at the enslaved experience, and particularly comparing it to the Haitian enslaved experience, which ultimately led to this great upheaval in their culture, this revolution, what we were given space to do, allowed to do, prevented from producing, is a great deal different than what many of our ancestors would have experienced within the confines of their experience. So we cannot take for granted sort of the liberty of having a little plot of beans and greens, if you will, in Congo Square, being allowed to dance a little, drum a little. We cannot take for granted that, we cannot assume that it is the totality of our voodoo representation. We cannot assume that it is the totality of the indigenous footprint here in the Americas from the many ethnic groups that were enslaved and brought here. Voodoo was brought to French Louisiana during the colonial period by enslaved sub-Saharan Africans from West Africa. From 1719 to 1731, the majority of African captives brought to and enslaved in Louisiana were Fon people from what is now Benin. Other groups such as the Bambara, the Mandinka, the Wolof, the Ewe, the Fobi, the Fon from Dahomian, the Nago, Yoruba, Nago, the Chamba, the Congo, the Igbo, the Ado, Hausa, Shango, all brought their cultural practices, languages, religions, beliefs, rooted in spirit and ancestor worship here to New Orleans. Not just to Congo Square, but here to New Orleans, here to Louisiana. For those who aren't familiar with the city, the French Quarter was New Orleans City proper. For those familiar with the city, you cross Congo Square and you cross, not Congo Square, you leave the French Quarter and you cross Rampart Street and you come into what is now known as Louis Armstrong Park. It is in the confines of that park that we find the footprint for Congo Square. Near to the park, on just the opposite side of the park, is Basin Street. Basin Street. And Basin Street is called such because there's a basin, a water basin that sort of terminates there within that curved area, which connects us back to Bayou St. John. So this would have been a sort of isolated wilderness, if you will. This would have been unincorporated area, if you will. If some of you can remember Armstrong Park before Hurricane Katrina, before 2005, it was pretty isolated. It was pretty abandoned. Mahalia Jackson was not there, and Municipal Auditorium was not in operation fully and completely at that time. We had very, tragic events take place in the cover of bush and trees within that park, just in a modern context. So when we look at 1690, 1700, 1710, 1720, we're still really talking about an unincorporated, wooded, wet, marshy, swampy area, which was of no value, mind you, to the colonizers, but was given to us. as sort of a little place we could come together, you know, on Sundays unimpeded. And I think we demonstrated in the TV show Underground very well, if I had to say so myself, sort of the ever-present eye and ear of the oppressor, even in Congo Square. Even in Congo Square. So Master could ride his horse out and watch you dance, watch you perform, be sure you were where you said you were, send others out to be sure you were where you said you were. In some cases, you were selling, you know, product, and they want their tax, they want their part too. So it wasn't like we were, you know, in the mountain regions of Brazil and had area to really develop rooted culture and tradition. Now that happened out in New Orleans East. And around June 19th every year, I tell the story of Saint Milo and his adventures as a revolutionary and maroon who not only escaped physical enslavement, but came and went, came into the city, came into the French Quarter to get rations, to get supplies, to get resources, to carry information, and would then go back out into the swamps of New Orleans East, you know, and exist for some time until they were eventually all sort of corralled and hung and beheaded unceremoniously in Jackson Square. And on June 19th, on June 19th, the same day many of you acknowledge Juneteenth. I also want to take this time to not only look at Marie Laveau and her, you know, living date, her arrival to the planet and her departure, but as I stated earlier in the show, also what was going on around her, what went on before her, what predated her footprint that would have moistened and fertilized the soil to allow even a free woman of color to rise to the level of voodoo queen, you know, in a Catholic, you know, dominated city. I'm going to share a little bit of Gina DeMuro, published back in March 28, 2018, updated October 5th, 2019, the real story of Marie Laveau. Let me see if I can put that on screen for y'all. Give me a second here, and thank you for bearing with me while I run through the technology. I appreciate that. I will come back to the chat, so I'm not going to ignore your questions or comments. I also invite you to area code 845-277-9143. You can also pop in on the screen. I think that would be helpful. Okay, the real story of Marie Laveau, New Orleans Witchy Voodoo Queen by Gina DeMuro. Marie Laveau is famous for being New Orleans Voodoo Queen, but was she really as evil and mystical as she was portrayed? There's nowhere in the world quite like New Orleans. No other city so visibly encapsulates the mix of old world and new world, and no other city so obviously displays its belief in the supernatural. And of course, no other city has its share of stories that would seem impossible anywhere else except in the Big Easy. Now take, for instance, the legend of Marie Laveau, the Voodoo Queen of New Orleans, a Black priestess of astonishing beauty. Madame Laveau wielded tremendous power in her community, and rumors of her magical abilities were so persistent that visitors still go to her grave to leave tokens to exchange for a small request. Now, side note, you can't do that anymore. You can't do that anymore. You can't go into St. Louis Cemetery unmonitored by a licensed tour guide and security. You cannot mark up the graves. You cannot leave a bunch of stuff down at the tomb. You can't do that anymore. That stopped officially 2018, And now it has stopped altogether, in the season of COVID-19. So the tours aren't even running through the cemeteries right now. So you're now seeing a propagation of Marie Laveau footprint in other areas of the city. And I think the Healing Center and Sally and Glassman would probably be one of the first, in my memory, to establish sort of a space for acknowledgement and recognition of Marie Laveau away from the cemetery. Many of you know I have also set up such a space, a sacred space for Marie Laveau here in the new temple space. And those of you who will be coming on tomorrow to celebrate Marie Laveau's birthday with me will be some of the very first people, aside for a handful of celebrities. You'll be some of the first people to go in there and see and experience not just the Marie Laveau Shrine, but the new space that we now have to work from and bring you future ceremonies and events from. Voodoo is a big part of New Orleans. You hear me say, if you can't talk about New Orleans without voodoo. You can't discuss New Orleans culture, New Orleans food, New Orleans tradition, New Orleans music, without covering voodoo. And so while Hollywood and pop culture tends to focus in on zombies and voodoo dolls with pins in them and the like, I like to believe that truth is wilder sometimes than fiction. And so when you really get to understand people like Boi Coupee, for instance, who is a slave, former slave, whose real name was Squire, who reached legendary status. Some would say, Marcus Akinlana and I would say he became Loa. He would indeed be the first enslaved African documented on paper to become Orisha, to become Loa. So when you're pulling for, let me stop this other document so that I can pull up yet a new document for you, demonstrating Boi Coupee and who he was. Bear with me, y'all. I got to push so many buttons just to make this happen. It's got to be an easier way. Okay. So Boi Coupee is the fictitious name for a real enslaved African whose name was Squire, who lived in the early 19th century up until about 1837 in Louisiana. Boi Coupee, again, was a talented entertainer and dancer who was allowed by his master, by his owner, to travel. But after numerous escape attempts in 1834, a planner's patrol, your paddy rollers, your original police who went out to capture Africans and capture them back into slavery, and in some cases capture free people into slavery. They got a hold to him in 1834 and captured him and subsequently amputated his arm, and thus he became Boi Coupee. Now, after that, Squire continued to run. And that's what's interesting. We hear Nanny the Maroon. We hear about Maroon culture in South America and in other regions. But we ain't heard a whole lot of talk about Boi Coupee. There ain't been no movie yet about Boi Coupee. I hope to be a part of that undertaking. And indeed, he is our first Loa born out of enslavement. That's well documented. He not only continued to escape, continued to run, but went on to reach legendary status. Squire ran away again and organized a gang of escaped slaves, as well as sympathetic whites, which was unheard of in 1830. And the gang robbed, plantations, robbed stores, robbed merchants. And in 3 years, until his death, Boi Coupee's fame grew to the point where he was superhuman. He was given such superhuman attributes like immunity to bullets. When shot by hunters in 19, I keep saying 19, when shot by hunters in 1837, he survived, but was recaptured in the hunt of a former ally, fisherman Francisco Garcia. He was bludgeoned to death with a club so that Garcia could claim a ransom of $2,000, which was a real big amount of money back in that time. And so the character Boi Coupee, which also reappeared in an 1880 novel, The Grand Disseminés, a story of Creole life by George Washington Cable, is legendary and should be as well known as not only a Marie Laveau, but some of your prior revolutionaries. Give me a second. I'm going to pull up another document. I'm often asked about books. Well, books, what do you read? Where do you study that? Are you just getting that out of Wikipedia? No. And again, no. And if you didn't hear me the first time, it's a whole lot going on at the bottom of the page for Wikipedia. And if you choose to do so, you can study and read that, and it will further your understanding of where I'm getting a great deal of this information and this platform from. So just bear with me. I'm trying to talk and post my document at the same time. Okay. Forgive me, Blog Talk Radio. I'm here. I'm just doing things y'all can't see till I get it up on the screen. Okay, this is a document I wanted to share. It's not necessarily relevant to this particular point, but since I got it on the screen, it's called The Underground Railroad from Slavery to Freedom. The Underground Railroad from Slavery to Freedom. It's www.gutenberg, Gutenberg, Gutenberg.org /files, FILES /490 38 /490 38 hyphen lowercase h /490 38 hyphen lowercase h .htm. And I'm gonna put that in the chat, make it easier for you to pull that up. So it's in this document too that we find Chandra, see, if I haven't said it enough, I'm a son of a retired school teacher. My mom didn't play. So we had to read the small print. We had to read what was at the bottom of the book. We had to read the details, you know. Hoodoo occultism, my coming event is tomorrow. I'm not sure about Halloween just yet. No one is sure about Halloween just yet. Some of the major events that we would normally recognize here in New Orleans, like Crew of Boo, have already been canceled. So I'm not sure about Halloween yet. So give me a moment. That's one of the reasons why I went on and moved forward on the Marie Laveau event now, because I wasn't quite sure to what degree we'd be able to come back out again in October. So this document, The Underground Railroad, Levi Coffin receiving a company of fugitives in the outskirts of Cincinnati, Ohio. That's what this picture here is. And so as the name would state, it speaks a lot about people, places, and things relative to escaping from freedom from enslavement. And so, yes, even in a document like this, you know, the methods of the Underground Railroad, for example, underground agents, station keepers, and conductors, the study of the map of the Underground Railroad system, abduction of slaves from the South. You know, we were abducted. You've heard Harriet Tubman and the stories of, you know, you couldn't turn around on Harriet Tubman. You couldn't try and run back on Harriet Tubman. And that wasn't just, you know, the conditions of being with Harriet Tubman. That was the conditions of enslavement. And so, indeed, if you got your freedom and you could afford to free your mama or your wife or your family or your children, then you indeed would pay someone to abduct them, to go and steal them, if you will, off the plantation and bring them into freedom. So even in a document like this, and of course a document as big as this, there are historic references to voodoo, hoodoo, conjure, root working for means of protecting, you know, from danger, protecting from the patty rollers, protection from the slave police, but also in terms of healing wounds. You know, maybe you injured yourself on the run. Maybe you were already dealing with some sort of sickness, illness, and or disease. Thank you, Free Bree. I appreciate you being here as well, beloved. Thank you so much. I appreciate all of you for taking the time out in the middle of your day to sort of tune in to this shady, cranky old guy who sort of gives you this hardcore, traditional, rooted, you know, root work foundation, conjure foundation, hoodoo foundation. And so I'm always grateful for each and every one of you who shows up with me to be a part of this platform. And understand it's necessary. Even in 2020, which is why we're having this conversation, the idea that voodoo has always been in competition with what's real, what's true, what's empowering about us. It has always been in competition with religion versus commercialism. It has always been in competition with, you know, culture and sacred religion and, you know, selling gree-grees, selling something quick and easy, you know, to make the next buck. And we still see that demonstration today. We still see that behavior today. People move in every day. People relocate in every day, and they're going to make it big in supernatural. They're going to make it big in hoodoo and root work and botanica and shop owning and et cetera. And they're going to do it better than anybody that's came before. They're going to do it better than anybody that's ever been. Yet they negate this history that I'm freely sharing with you right now, that I'm freely gifting to you right now. So this is, again, a shelf, if you will, of some of the books that are on my bookshelf in Amazon, in my Amazon library, that speak to not only Marie Laveau, but the contemporaries of Marie Laveau, those who existed during her time, those powerful men and women who existed before her time. In a more modern context, she's been made to be the Voodoo Queen. And indeed, the Voodoo Queen has now been set up as if it's the only voodoo that has ever existed in New Orleans. And so we don't hear about Dr. John. We don't hear about those male predecessors to Marie Laveau's demonstration. And if I haven't said it clearly enough, primarily out of fear. The oppressor would have never wanted Black men, and certainly Black women and children, to be empowered by voodoo, to be empowered by that African BS, that African mumbo jumbo, that African hoodoo, mojo, voodoo stuff, you know? And so Marie Laveau is credited to doing something real powerful by way of 5 years later, with the help of the Haitian Revolution, sort of bringing voodoo out of the closet for the rest of the world, for the consuming world. Prior to that, prior to Marie Laveau, it wasn't about consumerism. It wasn't about commercialism. It was the only thing that we had. It was the only medicine that we had. Sometimes it was the only doctor, you know, in the neighborhood. Sometimes it was the only midwife in the neighborhood. So these are very powerful books, documents that I've read. Some of them can be found for free. Some of them you gotta buy, you know, to sort of get into the more juicier parts. But these are some of my favorites. It happened in Louisiana, remarkable events that shaped the history. It happened in America by Bonnier Stewart. Louisiana, History of an American State by Ann Campbell. Hardback, Louisiana Legacies, Reading in the History of the Pelican State. I believe this is also a hardback. In Acadiana, Louisiana's historic Cajun country. Because y'all get Cajun and Creole mixed up sometimes, and I need y'all to kind of figure that out. Gumbo Yaya, a collection of Louisiana folk tales. You're going to find some voodoo and some hoodoo in that book, by Robert Tallant and Lyle Saxton. Creole Italian, one of my favorite former media people here in town, Tammy Eswick. Creole Italian, Sicilian immigrants and their shaping of New Orleans food and culture. And that book is by Justin Nystrom. The Cajuns and Other Characters, True Stories from South Louisiana, The History of Acadians, and many, 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 many more. I mean, I could just literally do a book, I do a show, a 3-hour show of just books, of just what I read, of just what I study, of just what I pull from on any given day. Another good book, Becoming Free, Becoming Black, Race, Freedom, and Law in Cuba, Virginia, and Louisiana. So these are some books that you can explore, that you can search, that you can buy in some cases, that you can locate in other cases, that help to fill in some of the gaps, that help to fill in the truths about not just Louisiana voodoo, but New Orleans voodoo, New Orleans specific. And again, you'll never, ever convince me that you had 100 years of Fon, Bambara, Mandinka, Wolof, Fulbe, Ewe, Yoruba, Shamba, Igbo, Hausa, and that somehow they forgot how to count in this journey. And particularly the first 100 years of Louisiana culture, there was not yet a precedent. There was not yet a well settled in voodoo culture. This was new. So they're still finding their way. They're still remembering things. They're still figuring out how to mask things. And so it explains the richness of New Orleans culture. Listen, if you're in competition with me, you're in competition with New Orleans. If you're trying to silence me, you're trying to silence New Orleans. You're trying to silence the ancestors. You're trying to silence those who came before. And you're riding on a narrative that has been very lucrative and beneficial to everybody except my community, to everybody except Black people, to everybody except Treme, to everybody except those who have roots here, have lineage here, have ancestral ties here, and ultimately to the story of the African American. It's a continuation of the narrative that we don't know our language, we don't know our gods, that we take and accept what we've been given, and that everything else has a root but us. Everything else has a connection to something organic and authentic but us. Except for those who would otherwise come in and save us from somewhere else. So I allow space for all of our cousins. I allow space for all of our brothers and sisters. I just want, thank you, Shamafia, I just want to confront the mental slavery in the current society that continues to keep us locked down, quiet, docile, controlled, by forces that don't have community at heart. Listen, if you have the community at heart, we'd be coming together. If you were authentic about your demonstration for New Orleans, we'd be coming together. If you were authentic about your demonstration for voodoo, we would be coming together. Not stirring a wicked pot, a wicked stew, and poisoning everybody at your party. It's just ugly. It's just ugly. Let me have your questions, your comments, your request. I am available at 845-277-9143 if you want to jump on. Ja Queen, Dr. John Montanet. Yeah, Dr. John Montanet was said to be from Senegal. And depending on the document you read, depending on the book author that you read, some would also say that he passed through both Haiti, either Haiti or Cuba, if not both. And so again, that gives credibility in the Western American mindset, and I mean Black people, about his authenticity, his connection to the root. And even in some of the documents in the archives that I've managed to gain access to, a common theme, a common story with many voodoo practitioners of that time was performance. And that's something that exists till today. There's not very many Black events, for instance, that go on, to include My Alpha, in the commemoration of My Alpha, that don't include a Haitian demonstration, or a Panamanian demonstration, or a Honduran or Brazilian demonstration. And so, again, when we think about it in terms of spirituality and religion, it's a continuation, beloved, of a narrative that we didn't have no gods, we didn't have no beliefs, we didn't have no ways of being. And Dr. John is not the only named and documented practitioner that existed in New Orleans, that existed in Louisiana, as far west as Baton Rouge, before Marie Laveau. And so where some would say we gained something from Haiti, I would say that we actually lost something, and to some degree became further in bondage, because now there's this fear of revolution. So beyond Dr. John, which would include Marie Laveau, I can see a concerted political effort to push a free woman of color who maybe was real beautiful, because they keep talking about how beautiful she was. They keep talking about the dynamics and the math and the symmetry of her body. Put that in a modern context. Who is said to be more attractive? Halle Berry. Who's said to be more camera worthy? So I don't think that that's a new concept. I think that that's why we hear more about Marie Laveau and not so much about Dr. John. We hear more about Marie Laveau and not so much about Sanete Dede, who came after Marie Laveau and carried on the name, if you will, carried on the legacy. Someone else who came much later on in our time, 1937, from Haiti, Fred Stanton. So it'd be very difficult for me to talk about New Orleans voodoo, Marie Laveau, and not talk about Chicken Man. Some of y'all know him as Chicken Man, but he also continues the narrative that the only authentic demonstration of voodoo in New Orleans has to come from somebody from Haiti or somebody from outside the country. And then there's that element of performance. Now, those of you who are unfamiliar, Chicken Man, bit the head off chickens as an act of performance, and of course gave it, that extra voodoo connotation. Some would even suggest that he admitted to just performing. Dr. John, who taught Marie Laveau, was known for voodoo. Dr. John was known as Bayou John, Prince John, was born in Senegal, kidnapped as a slave before becoming a prominent voodoo king. Some would say he created New Orleans voodoo, Dr. John, in the late 19th century in New Orleans. He brought his knowledge of the craft from his home country, Senegal. Now, we associate Senegal with Islam today. Now, if you remember, Alex Haley drew roots from Senegambia, right in the middle of Senegal, from this same region in which Dr. John is said to have originated. He came and he joined an already prominent voodoo community here in New Orleans. This predates Marie Laveau. And this voodoo community existed as early as 1700 and developed from African slave groups such as the Bambara, the Mandinka, the Wolof, the Ewe, the Fulbe, the Nard, the Mina, the Yoruba, the Shampa, the Igbo, the Hausa, and previous natives of Senegal were already enslaved in New Orleans by 1720 in the environment in which we know Dr. John is documented. Through Dr. John's work in the medicinal aspects of voodoo, he gained a reputation for being an excellent healer. Some reports went as far as to state that he had the ability to resurrect or resuscitate patients on the verge of death through his rituals. This is one of the earliest voodoo accounts of reanimation, leading to the myth of zombies in Louisiana, not Haiti, in Louisiana. However, it has been reported that Dr. John confessed to friends that his magic was a sham. He had been known to laugh, writes Robert Talon, in Voodoo in New Orleans. Voodoo in New Orleans was written in 1946. I believe it was republished in 1946, and it was originally written in maybe 1939. I'm not sure. It could be referencing a page in the book. But he talks about Dr. John suggesting that he offered, fake gree-gree, fake voodoo powder, to the white women for money. I don't believe that necessarily contradicts or invalidates the presence of real voodoo in the community at that time. In fact, it reinforces what I said about sort of this conflict between voodoo and what's authentic to voodoo, and then performance, and a political agenda, whereas some people still to this day ain't happy about you sharing voodoo with the Western world, not happy about you offering voodoo up to the tourist, offering voodoo up as a source of entertainment. There are those within tourist shops, souvenir shops, gift shops that sell stuff that don't believe or care anything about voodoo other than its curio value. Its curio value. Thank you, Divine Self-Healing. Yes, so there are indeed real, legitimate people that existed here in Louisiana, and not just here in Louisiana. Again, I think if you want to study voodoo in Louisiana, you got to study more than just voodoo. You also have to study geography, politics, government, law, and that's why we all, dream for these great books where the authors have done all this great work, and it's all in the footnotes and it's all in the index and it's all in the bibliography, and make it real easy for us to do. But this is what I do every day. And not only am I actively writing a book right now, but I'm also constantly having to reprove and revalidate voodoo, what voodoo is, and how voodoo shows up in the world, because our history often was not documented, because our history often was not talked about, because our history was not valued enough to be documented, or talked about. Thank you, beloved. Congo Square West. Yes. Enzo Khalifa. Thank you, beloved. I appreciate you as well. Now I want to share. Give me a moment. This is 1930 to 1940. Slave portraits from 1930 to 1940. To bring it together for you, my my father was born in 1938. My mother was born in 1942. So my mother's mother, the only grandparent whose birth date I know right off the top of my head, was born in 1922. So these would be from 1930 to 1940. I'll put the link in the chat. And so these would be either photographs that people still had that they were sharing, and then of course sharing the slave narratives that went along with them. Some of them are also recorded. I've been aware of this archive for some years, as early as back in the Yahoo 360 days. So that's an interesting link. Some of my expert researchers in the group would be happy to delve into, to tear into. And these are the things that I come across when I'm looking for a voodoo footprint, a hoodoo footprint, a conjure footprint. I just realized I have not been broadcasting on Blog Talk Radio the whole time. So forgive me, Blog Talk Radio. Y'all couldn't hear me. Forgive me, Blog Talk Radio. Yeah, the whole show did not air for Blog Talk Radio, so forgive me. And if you want to share the show, please share the YouTube link or the Facebook link from where you are now viewing or sharing or participating from. There is no Blog Talk Radio archive for today. So this is the slave portraits, slave narratives, and again, these were collected in 1930 to 1940, and they are, memories of what's held over from the slave era. And surprisingly, some of these people and their environment look like my people today in northern Louisiana, in central Mississippi, deep off into the Delta. So I invite you to share that link and that information. I also want to share with you some videos. So listen, I'm not ending the show. I'm just sharing some videos that coincide with what we're talking about. And hopefully you all will have some commentary after the fact. So let's look at the mysterious tycoon and abolitionist, Mary Ellen Pleasant. And what does she have to do with voodoo?
Mary Ellen Pleasant was born on the 19th of August. Mary Ellen Pleasant
Forgive me, y'all. I'm trying to get rid of the ads. Stop.
was born on the 19th of August, 1814, though this is disputed, as her gravestone in California states 1817. Her origins are unclear, as it's believed she was born into slavery on a Georgia plantation, yet she would later state that she was born free in Philadelphia to a full-blooded negress from Louisiana, referring to her mother and a Hawaiian father. As a young girl, she was separated from her family, though the details of how this came about are unknown. It's speculated that when she was around 10 to 13 years old, she arrived in Nantucket, Massachusetts, where she worked as a domestic servant for a white family. During this time, she discovered that being invisible to those around her could be very useful. She would later turn this trait into an advantage. While with her family, she was treated well, learning to read, write, and how to work in the shop. Apparently, the family was deeply involved in the abolitionist movement. This may have ignited her passion for the cause, as she met many famous abolitionists. Pleasant was an intelligent girl who learned quickly, despite not having received any type of formal education. In her 1902 biography, she stated, "I often wonder what I may have been with an education." She then goes on to write that, "I have let books alone and studied men and women a good deal. I have always noticed that when I have something to say, people listen. They never go to sleep on me." Some years after, Pleasant married her first husband, called James Smith. He was a wealthy flower contractor and merchant who was of white or mixed ancestry. Smith was also a staunch abolitionist, and together they worked on the Underground Railroad as slave stealers. The couple helped slaves flee from their slaveholders by hiding them in safe houses, later transporting them to the US northern states or even as far as Canada. Unfortunately, Smith died in the 1840s, leaving Pleasant with a considerable inheritance and instructions to continue the crucial work they had dedicated years to. Pleasant continued to help transport slaves to freedom. Throughout her life, she would continue her strong support of equal rights. Then, in 1848, she started a relationship with a black man named John James Pleasant. It's speculated that this was her second husband, as she took his last name, although there's no official records of the marriage taking place. Together, they followed Smith's instructions, but after a few years, they were forced to move to New Orleans due to rising suspicion from slavers. It was around this time that the California Gold Rush began. In 1850, California joined the Union as a free, non-slavery state, and word soon spread about the potential fortunes to be made there, no matter your race or background. Owing to this, in April 1852, Pleasant decided to leave New Orleans and made her way to San Francisco. As a light-skinned black woman, she passed as white and made sure to use her first husband's surname when interacting with whites to reduce potential discrimination. She soon found a job as a cook and domestic servant for wealthy businessmen. These were some of the city's most important men, and she worked for them for a specific reason. To these men, she was invisible, and it was this dismissive attitude that she made the most of. Pleasant used her proximity to shrewdly eavesdrop on the wealthy people she served. By doing so, she picked up investment tips and juicy gossip. The biographer Lynn Hudson, in an interview about Pleasant, stated, "It's quite possible that the jobs she had as a domestic were a cover that she
Send money from home via our app or
was using because she clearly made her money from investments. As a cook in San Francisco, Pleasant reportedly earned around $500 a month. With this money, as well as the inheritance from her first husband, she invested in real estate, gold, and silver mines. She eventually made enough money to start her own laundry business, and from there she expanded. In San Francisco, Pleasant continued to help former slaves with financial aid and by finding employment for them. As she became more successful, she brought many into her service and gave them important positions. Within wealthy white circles, she was seen as a business owner, and to many, she was seen as one of their own. Yet, only the black community knew her real identity. She was known as the Black City Hall, who brought the Underground Railroad to the West. Some of those she aided would later become important black leaders in the city. In 1857, she left San Francisco to aid the abolitionist John Brown. She actively supported his cause, sending him a total of around $30,000. With this money, he was able to finance his raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry in Virginia. Brown had hoped that this would provoke a larger armed slave revolt in the South, but his plan failed. In 1859, Pleasant returned to San Francisco, where she continued to run her businesses and support civil rights movements. On the 2nd of December of the same year, John Brown was hung for murder and treason. After the hanging, they found a note in his pocket which read, "The axe is laid at the foot of the tree. When the first blow is struck, there will be more money to help." The note was signed by M.E.P. for Mary Ellen Pleasant. Yet, officials misread the letters and were on the lookout for someone with the initials W.E.P. They had no idea who wrote the note, but were presumably after a wealthy northerner. Pleasant was never suspected, and we only know it was her as she revealed this before her death. By the 1860s, Pleasant owned boarding houses and a chain of thriving laundry businesses. Despite her success, she remained humble. On many occasions, she would disguise herself as a servant so she could be overlooked. She then met a young bank clerk called Thomas Bell. Together, they formed a decades-long business partnership which would make both parties extremely wealthy. The Scotsman was already making decent money by trading in mercury, more commonly known as quicksilver, but when he met Pleasant, he realized just how successful he could become by her side. In 1865, following the end of the Civil War, Pleasant went to the city directory and publicly changed her racial designation from white to black. She did this to stand up for racial tensions that existed in the country, despite this making life more difficult for herself. In one of her memoirs, she wrote that her cause was the freedom and equality for myself and for my people, and I'd rather be a corpse than a coward. Pleasant's personal relationship with Bell is uncertain. It's possible that it was romantic for a time, but sources differ. In any case, they began to invest in a variety of businesses, with Pleasant leading the way. For the most part, Bell simply followed her advice and guidance. As Pleasant had now registered as black, she was afraid that people would start to question how she made all this money. In order to avoid potential problems and discrimination, she put investments and properties in Bell's name. This facilitated business dealings, which may have been more difficult for a woman during the 1860s, especially for a black woman. Pleasant publicly attacked racial discrimination occurring in San Francisco and continued to look out for civil rights. In 1866, while on a city streetcar, her and two other black women were forcibly removed. Because of this, she filed lawsuits against two streetcar companies for racial discrimination. One of the companies promised to allow African Americans to board their streetcars, while the other didn't back down. The case, Pleasant versus North Beach and Mission Railroad Company, made its way to the state Supreme Court. In the end, Pleasant paved the way for the desegregation of the city's streetcars.
The bag has its roots in music, and it was initially made for the music producer. Once we had the finished product, then I was like, okay, I need to have.
Thanks to these efforts, years later, she was recognized as the mother of civil rights in California. As the years went on, Pleasant and Bell's fortune continued to grow. They soon had shares in laundries, dairies, restaurants, boarding houses, and even Wells Fargo Bank. By 1875, they had amassed a huge fortune, estimated at over $30 million. To put that into perspective, it's equivalent to around $850 million today. In 1877, Pleasant's former partner, John James, who had worked on the Underground Railroad with her, died of diabetes. It's unsure what type of relationship they had after her alliance with Thomas Bell. With her vast wealth, Pleasant built a 30-room Victorian-style mansion in the heart of San Francisco. The house had large grounds and was, of course, lavishly furnished. At the time, it was worth around $100,000, equivalent to $2.4 million today. Pleasant lived in the mansion along with Bell and his family, as well as staff. She also bought various other properties, such as a huge 1,000-acre ranch in the Sonoma Valley, northeast of San Francisco. But by the 1880s, things were changing in San Francisco. The city that had allowed her to create a fortune was becoming a much more overtly racist city. Because of her wealth, many grew jealous. Local whites became hostile and started to shun her, stating that she was Bell's mistress and nothing more. Furthermore, rumors started to spread that her boarding houses were actually brothels, and that she had some otherworldly hold over the wealthy white people she was close to. Then, in 1883, Pleasant became entangled in the scandalous trial of the Nevada Senator William Sharon. He was accused of seducing and then abandoning a young woman called Sarah Hill. This trial was reported everywhere, every day, and it wasn't long until the whole nation was following the events. The senator's lawyers claimed that Pleasant, who was Sarah Hill's friend, had used dark forces to manipulate her into entrapping the senator. Despite this being absurd, Pleasant went along with it and brought a voodoo doll to court. She claimed that she would use her powers to cause his death. The crazy thing is that soon after she stated this, still in the trial, the senator died. This confirmed many suspicions, and she was soon seen as an evil, mythical figure. Many thought of her as a voodoo queen. It was also around this time that they began to call her the racist nickname Mammy Pleasant, because of the years she spent as a domestic servant. The press also called her by this name, but she didn't like this. She said, "I don't like to be called Mammy by everybody. Put that down. I am not Mammy to everybody in California." I received a letter from a pastor in Sacramento. It was addressed to Mammy Pleasant. I wrote back to him on his own paper that my name was Mrs. Mary E. Pleasant. I wouldn't waste any of my paper on him. In 1899, Thomas Bell passed away. This had far-ranging repercussions for Pleasant. When he was found dead in Pleasant's mansion, his widow, Teresa Bell, on a full-page smear campaign in the San Francisco Chronicle with the headline, "The Queen of the Voodoos." The press portrayed her as a monster.
Vimeo has become part
these
of
commercials.
everyday processes. We are using Vimeo.
They want to make you
on our
pay to
website.
keep commercials.
Accusing her of witchcraft, implying that she had murdered Bell. Teresa Bell and her son Fred Bell then sued Pleasant for control of the shared multi-million-dollar fortune. A series of court battles followed, but things weren't looking very positive for Pleasant. Firstly, her reputation had been tarnished by newspaper allegations regarding her brothels voodoo practices, and some rumors even said that she ate and stole babies. Furthermore, lots of her properties, including the mansion she designed and built, were held in Belle's name. This made it very difficult for her to prove ownership. To further harm her reputation, lies were told of her. In one case, it states that she kept the feeble near senile Belle, a prisoner in his mansion at the corner of Octavia and Bush, and that she fed his children dog meat and stale bread. In spite of these difficulties, Pleasant made a strong case that the mansion was indeed hers. Well, she showed the court evidence proving she had designed and paid for its construction. However, in the end she lost the legal battle, along with her reputation and most of her fortune. Shortly after this, she was evicted from her San Francisco mansion, and she soon plunged into poverty. With her wealth depleted, she depended on the kindness of friends to put a roof over her head. By the end of her life, she was a famous figure in San Francisco, even though she was seen as a demon to some. Mary Ellen Pleasant died in 1904 at the age of 89. Despite all that she managed to accomplish during her life, she isn't as well remembered as she ought to be. This is mainly down to her activities being secretive or quite controversial. Furthermore, her life is surrounded in mystery due to a lack of evidence. For example, she wrote 3 autobiographies, but each one has contradictions. On her deathbed, she asked for her gravestone to state, "A friend of John Brown." This was added 60 years after her passing. In San Francisco, there's a day dedicated to Mary Ellen Pleasant, and a park named after her, near to where her home once stood. The park is the smallest in the city, and her ghost is said to haunt it and throw eucalyptus nuts at people who pass by at night. Thank you everyone for watching this video on Mary Ellen Pleasant.
I also think it's important to note that often powerful women, powerful Black women and men were accused of voodoo or even demonized during the time of Marie Laveau, predating Marie Laveau and right thereafter, almost as if we are incapable of study, incapable of knowledge, incapable of acquiring anything on our own without the use of some sort of vicious and controlling magic. Another story that comes to mind, one of Julia Brown, born in 1845 as Julia Bernard. She was also known as Julia Black, Julia White, and was branded with the Voodoo press. She was born in Louisiana around 1845, then married a laborer named Celestine Brown in 1880. So about 20 years later, the federal government gave her husband 40-acre homestead plot to farm, property that likely passed on to Julia after her husband's death around 1914. So again, we have a family who acquired their 40 acres and a mule, if you will. The husband, not very long after, passes away. And then not even a year later, Julia Brown passes away. And Julia Brown died the 28th of September, 1915. 28th of September, 1915, age 70. Funeral was the very next day. On the 2nd of October, 1915, the New Orleans Times posted that she had passed. They had gathered to have her funeral. And on that same day, a hurricane hit. And prior to this, Julia Brown was said to be a root doctor, a root worker, a hoodoo woman. Remember now, she had a lot of land, a lot of property. She was a landlord. She had tenants. So often when you have that landlord-tenant scenario. Even today, there's negative talk, there's gossip talk, there's bad feelings sometimes when you're dealing with tenant landlord scenarios. But this was all attributed to voodoo with her. She was said to sing this blues song. One day I'm gonna die, and I'm gonna take the whole town with me. And of course, this hurricane comes and wipes out Frenia, Ruddock, Napton, Louisiana. And so she goes down, as another legendary voodoo queen. Sanite Dede succeeded Marie Laveau. I spoke about her a little bit earlier in the show, and how it was said that Marie Laveau verbally and publicly sort of passed on the baton, if you will, to Sanite Dede before she then retired and passed away. But a great deal of the idea of commercializing voodoo, popularizing voodoo in a tourist entertainment sector rests with Sanite Dede and Annie Christmas and Rosalie. Rosalie, 1850, was said to be the only real challenger to Marie Laveau. And hence we have the story of the doll. I don't know if y'all noticed the story of the doll in the video with Mary Pleasant. And she was accused of being a voodoo priest and accused of doing this work. And so she brought a voodoo doll to court and basically cursed the man, and he died on the spot. But Rosalie lived in the time of Marie Laveau and was said to be a contemporary to Marie Laveau, was doing quite well, quite successful. It is said that Rosalie acquired a doll, but this doll is described in great detail. It's said to have been carved from one piece of wood, from a tree. So for some of us in this audience with a little bit more of an experienced ear, we hear a bochi, we hear a sajiti, which is a wood carved human-like form to the Yoruba people, to the Ewe people, that has a very distinct purpose in healing, in medicine. So this doll could have been misinterpreted, but it was said that it was carved specifically for her in Africa and then transported here to New Orleans for her to use. And that Marie Laveau sort of went in when Sanite Dede wasn't home one day and just picked it up and walked away with it. So there are many who precede Marie Laveau, who come after Marie Laveau, who came before Marie Laveau, as real representatives of the power, the legendary power, mystery, fear, fantasy, entertainment around what voodoo is. The idea that there is no New Orleans voodoo is just a perpetuation of an old white supremacist, racist belief based in the ideology that we had no gods, that we had no sense of empowerment, that we had no source, if you will, of our own to sort of pull from, to draw from. Oh wow, it's almost 2 o'clock. Time just flies when we're in this space. Please, if you have questions, comments, requests, come on and let me have it. I hope I gave you enough about Dr. John, Bayou John. Okay, he was also said to have been kidnapped and brought to either Cuba or Haiti. He eventually moved to New Orleans as a cotton roller, where he became part of the local voodoo community. And I quote that from, I believe Sally Ann Glassman, one of her sites. I'm not sure. But there's a footprint for Dr. John. And even the musician, Dr. John, in the telling of his story, states that he pulled his theme, his inspiration, if you will, from this real figure. Now listen, if y'all don't have questions, comments, requests, I'm gonna stop and get me something to eat. But before I do so, I want to share another document here that you might find interesting about the settlement of America. First, from a Paleo-Indian perspective, a Meso-Indian perspective, Neo-Indian perspective, Indian life after the European settlement, Southern Louisiana, you know, the place that we call Congo Square, where we celebrate our ancestry, was also a sacred space to the Houma Indian. So the idea that Marie Laveau would have had to travel all the way to Bayou St. John in order to conduct ceremonies doesn't make a whole lot of sense unless we consider secrecy. And again, if it's too many eyes on Congo Square, outside our community, walking their dogs, touring, visiting, cycling, just kind of, you know, waiting on us to gather and drum and come together, then indeed you're not going to see and receive sort of that sacred element that we all carry here in our hearts, you know, in our spirit, to that space. So maybe she went down to Bayou St. John, maybe. But this is a good document. I'm gonna put the link in the chat. I'm sure some of my most, Nkisi, it could have been definitely an Nkisi. Yeah, Nkisi, Sajidi, they all come from sort of a similar root, a similar usage. Yeah, I'll do Black Hawk in a future show, in a coming show. I typically do it around Carnival, but I can talk about Black Hawk. Again, I thank Denise Alvarado for her tireless efforts in locating the documents, finding some of this information. There's some other links before I miss it too at the bottom of this page here for wetland formation, plant life, human interactions, ecosystem, hydrology, etc. And again, for those who are really into roots, conjure, herbs, plants, nature, those are some really, really interesting links to sort of dive into. One of my introductions to what is available where I live, what grows where I live, what type of plants are natural and organic to where I live, meaning the region where you live, the seasonal changes, climate where you live, and then of course what you're able to produce and reproduce, either in pots or in the ground and soil, you know, or even cultivate in the wild. So those documents are at the bottom of that last link. Some of y'all will find that real curious. I also want to share Legends of America. Legends of America. Let me put that up on the screen for you. Just give me a moment here. Okay, where did it go? Legends of America. Legends of America. Legends of America. Where did it go? Where did it go? Why am I not seeing it now on my list? Okay, let me go back and look at that again. I think I just closed the link. Forgive me, y'all. I'm trying to put it up on the screen so that everybody can see it. So let me put it here first. And then let me put it somewhere where I can easily find it. Legends of America. So this is a Civil War timeline, Civil War timeline and leading events. So it starts right about 1830. Starts with the results of the 1830 census, suggesting a population of almost 12.8 million, of which 16% were enslaved Africans. Slaves are virtually non-existent in northern states and as high as 54% in South Carolina and 51% in Louisiana in 1830. So again, this is another great link. Many of you come through the port of Orleans. Many of you have ancestral roots in Louisiana and Mississippi, and might find this document interesting. It talks about Nat Turner in 1831, August of 1831, and the 60 whites that were killed in that slave uprising, that slave revolutionary act. It's a great document. If you go a little further down, it's got some root and some conjure in it. So you might find that a great read. See, I've shared that before, so I'm not going to reshare that. So yeah, that's what I'm looking at right now. We are having the Marie Laveau birthday celebration on tomorrow, so I'm grateful for those of you who have already RSVP'd for that and who will be present tomorrow with your offerings for Marie Laveau. Yes, we're going to do the Halloween Hoodoo occultism. We're going to do Halloween. You'll have some responsibility for helping me to bring it together, but we're going to do the Halloween. All is a blessing. Yes, all is a blessing. And for those of you who are here, I look forward to seeing you tomorrow for our Marie Laveau annual Marie Laveau birthday celebration and acknowledgement. And let's be clear, it's not a party. It's not a gathering. It'll be COVID-19 protocols tight, real tight, okay? It'll be a very personalized, very individualized experience. I'll allow you to come in and open house and see the place and acknowledge Marie Laveau in the shrine. I'm going to provide free divination for those who are here and are participating in that event. But we won't all be sitting down and gathered up and bunched up in a room. It won't be like that. Okay. So I look forward to it. I look forward to it. Yeah, Hoodoo occultism. We're going to make Halloween happen to the best of my ability. If I have to have it in the street, if I have to have it in the park, across the street, we'll make it happen. I want to also, before I leave you guys, I also want to keeping up with my Marie Laveau timeline. Now remember, Marie Laveau was born September 10th. Oh wow. 1796, September 10th, 1796. And so we talked about Sanite Dede, who really is the queen, voodoo queen that came right after her. We talked about Boi Coupee, you know, who had his arm shot off in 1843. So now I want to introduce into this conversation the legend of LaLaurie. LaLaurie, and some of you are familiar with LaLaurie, around 1833, 1834. And so for those of you who are unfamiliar with LaLaurie or only know of LaLaurie by way of American Horror Story, let me introduce some more academic documentary type information about who LaLaurie was.
Tucked into a corner on Royal Street in New Orleans, Louisiana, is an unassuming but beautiful home. It is famously known as the LaLaurie House. Its architecture and structure fits perfectly in with the old Spanish influence of the city. No special lights hang from the balcony above, no special markings hang around anywhere, but if you're looking for it, you will find it. The reason for the fame of this structure is dark and sinister. It reminds us of the potential evil of people when they are given access to own one another, and the social influence for people to look the other way when there's obviously something awful going on. Louis and Delphine LaLaurie lived in this lavish mansion amongst their peers in New Orleans in the 1800s. They were respected members of society, threw beautiful parties, and had the ears of the creme de la creme of that era. What their peers didn't know was their shared interest in torture, human experimentation, and ultimately murder. Delphine's previous two husbands both died, but left her with daughters. And on June 25, 1825, Delphine married for the third time, a physician named Leonard Louis Nicolas LaLaurie, who was much younger than she. In 1831, she bought property at 1140 Royal Street, which she managed in her own name with little involvement from her husband. And in 1832 had built a 2-story mansion there, complete with attached slave quarters. She lived there with Louis and 2 of her daughters, and maintained a central and well-respected position in New Orleans society. There are conflicting accounts of Madame LaLaurie's treatment of her slaves between 1831 and 1834. Harriet Martineau, writing in 1838 and recounting tales told to her by New Orleans residents during her 1836 visit, claimed LaLaurie's slaves were observed to be, quote, singularly haggard and wretched. However, in public appearances, LaLaurie was seen to be generally polite to black people and caring of her slaves' health. Court records of the time show that LaLaurie set free 2 of her own slaves, Jean-Louis in 1819 and de Vince in 1832. Nevertheless, Martineau reported that public rumors about LaLaurie's mistreatment of her slaves were well known, and a local lawyer was dispatched to Royal Street to remind LaLaurie of the laws relevant to the upkeep of slaves. During his visit, the lawyer found no evidence of wrongdoing or mistreatment of slaves by their keepers. A well-known story that lends to the legend of the mansion and its supposed hauntings. One of the LaLaurie's neighbors saw one of the LaLaurie's slaves, a 12-year-old girl named Leah, fall or jump to her death from the roof of the Royal Street mansion while trying to avoid punishment from Delphine LaLaurie brandishing a whip. Leah had been brushing Delphine's hair when she hit a snag, causing Delphine to grab a whip and chase her to the roof. The body of the child was buried on the grounds of the mansion. This incident led to an investigation of the LaLauries, in which they were found guilty of illegal cruelty and forced to forfeit 9 slaves. These 9 slaves were then bought back by the LaLauries through the intermediary of one of their relatives and returned to the Royal Street residences. This instance shows the power and influence that the LaLauries had over their peers. There were also reported stories that LaLaurie kept her cook chained to the kitchen stove and beat her daughters when they attempted to feed the slaves. According to accounts of the time, the following were the events of April 10th, 1834. During yet another LaLaurie party this evening, a fire broke out in the kitchen. While that happened, the entire party made its way into it. In true New Orleans fashion, nothing is to stop a party in full swing. The servers poured champagne for the well-to-do, and the food was still being consumed. All merriment simply relocated to a less dangerous position. When the police and fire marshals got there, they found a 17-year-old woman, the cook, chained to the stove by her ankle. She later confessed to them that she had set the fire as a suicide attempt for fear of her punishment being taken to the uppermost room, because she said that anyone who was taken there never came back. As reported in the New Orleans Bee of April 11, 1834, bystanders responding to the fire attempted to enter the slave quarters to ensure that everyone had been evacuated. Upon being refused the keys by the LaLauries, the bystanders broke down the doors to the slave quarters and found 7 slaves, more or less horribly mutilated, suspended by the neck, with their limbs apparently stretched and torn from one extremity to the other, who claimed to have been imprisoned there for some months. Many other accounts said that when the firemen went upstairs to the apartment, the smell was overwhelmingly wretched. The LaLauries, without confession, we are not sure which or if both of them mutilated their slaves. Some had their eyes sewn shut. Others had their body parts removed and placed elsewhere on their bodies. There was a woman called the Spider Woman, and with no detail, it is left to the imagination what kind of horror she endured. A man was stuck to the wall with his face dissected and pinned back to the wall. One man's genitals were removed, and a crude sexual reassignment surgery was imposed on him. And of course, as you would expect, all of these wounds were covered with maggots and flies. The majority of these horrors were put upon these poor people that most likely did not survive their injuries. Of course, this information was taken from witness accounts and reprinted in collections of stories by Henry Castellanos and George Washington Cable. When the discovery of the tortured slaves became widely known, a mob of local citizens attacked the LaLaurie residence and demolished and destroyed everything upon which they could lay their hands. A sheriff and his officers were called upon to disperse the crowd, but by the time the mob left, the Royal Street property had sustained major damage, with scarcely anything remaining but the walls. Before you cheer for the mob, however, they too were guilty of horribly ignoring the rumors and witness accounts of mistreatment and cruelty. Also, once the tortured slaves were taken to a local jail, they were available for public viewing. The New Orleans Bee reported that by April 12th, up to 4,000 people had attended to callously view the tortured slaves to convince themselves of their suffering, but it most likely added to their sufferings a humiliation compounding their grief. Some of the slaves revealed that there were other graves beyond the one of Leah, the girl who fell to her death, and it was found other graves on the property of slaves who had died due to unknown causes. Years later, when workmen were remodeling the interior, they found the skeletons of other victims dumped in holes under sections of the mansion's floor, so Delphine and Louis wouldn't have to answer for their demise. In the legend of the LaLauries, Madame Delphine and Monsieur Louis escaped the mob during the madness of the fire during the party via carriage to the waterfront, thereby taking a boat to Mobile, Alabama, then sailing off to Paris, France, where they would live out the rest of their lives free from justice. The story of Monsieur Louis' death, though not substantiated in any way by official documentation, is that he perished during a wild hog hunt. Though we cannot say if they ever officially returned to New Orleans, it is rumored that Madame Delphine did return after the death of Louis. There is a grave in the St. Louis cemetery with an inscription on the old copper plate that reads in French, Madame LaLaurie, born Marie Delphine McCarthy, died in Paris on December 7, 1842. According to French archives of Paris, however, Marie Delphine McCarthy died on December 7, 1849. At this point, I honestly have to fully plagiarize Wikipedia. My apologies. I am not a New Orleans native, but I do have full respect for its rich history. The house remained ruined, at least until 1836. But at some point prior to 1888, it was, quote, unrecognizably restored, and over the following decades was used as a public high school, a conservatory of music, a tenement, a refuge for young delinquents, a bar, a furniture store, and a luxury apartment building. In April 2007, Nicolas Cage bought the LaLaurie house through Hancock Park Real Estate Company for a sum of $3.45 million. The mortgage documents were arranged in such a way that Cage's name did not appear on them. On November 13th, 2009, the property then valued at $3.5 million was listed for auction as a result of bank foreclosure and purchased by Regions Financial Corporation for $2.3 million. Today, the LaLaurie Mansion is privately owned with no known tours available, though it still is, to this very day, an attraction of morbid curiosity and beauty. Its very name, still almost 200 years later, strikes fear and wonder into the hearts of all who hear the legend of Madame Delphine LaLaurie.
And so
thanks again, guys, for watching.
We should really understand the time in which this takes place in relationship to Marie Laveau, to other practitioners, to the demonstration of Congo Square, and the reality of our existence here under enslavement. I also want to share some more Marie Laveau information, if you will, if you all are still with me.
There's something to be said about the city of New Orleans, a city that so profoundly captures both the old world and the new, in its never-ending nightlife, its renowned cuisine, and the celebration of a diverse African, French, and American culture. Indeed, it seems like the sort of place where if magic could take place, it would be here, in the Big Easy. Of course, this brings me to one of New Orleans' most notable residents, Marie Laveau, the woman said to be the Voodoo Queen. Despite having been dead for over 200 years now, people still say that Marie Laveau has power over the city. Going by what the legends say about her voodoo practices, Laveau would perform remarkable feats, some saying they are nothing short of miracles. In this video, we'll primarily be focusing on Louisiana voodoo, or New Orleans voodoo, which is a product of the religion Voodoo, though heavily influenced by the Christian and French culture of New Orleans, in which Marie Laveau would become a staple of. Although there is plenty of information about Marie Laveau in the legends and lore of New Orleans, separating the fact from myth isn't exactly easy. We know little of Laveau's early life, other than that she was likely born in 1801 to a wealthy plantation owner, as some sources say, and his black mistress. Her father, who is also cited as being Charles Laveau, may also have been something of a politician, going on to become a mayor of New Orleans in 1812. Her mother was named Marguerite, and was also said to be something of a voodoo practitioner. We also know that Laveau would go on to marry a man named Jacques Paris, a carpenter who would give her 2 children. However, Paris would suddenly go missing in 1824, whereby Laveau would speak of his death, claiming to be a widow. Though it's equally believable that Paris had simply deserted Laveau, but that she was too prideful to admit this. After all, she was described as being a beautiful woman, tall with dark curly hair and golden skin. At the pinnacle of her notoriety, tabloids would describe her as having good features. Good features at the time meaning that she appeared to have the physical traits of a white woman more than a black one. After Paris's death, Marie would begin working in a beauty parlor as a hairdresser. This is actually one of the most important parts of her life, for it's here that she would service the wealthy white and Creole women of New Orleans, whereby they would confide in her their most intimate secrets, desires, information about their husbands, lovers, their estates, and family affairs. Many believe that this wealth of information that Laveau would receive on a daily basis is what gave her political leverage, and is the reason why she was able to rise up through the social ranks. Laveau would later begin a relationship with a man named Louis Christophe de Glapion, a man from a powerful local family whom she would birth 15 children to in rapid succession. It would lead her to quit hairdressing and devote her time to raising her brood. It's here she began to take interest in her mother's voodoo practices and traditional African beliefs. Voodoo had a sinister reputation for itself in Louisiana, and was even banned at several points. Many believed it was the art of the devil, and that it was here to usurp Christianity, turning Christians and good folk onto a darker path filled with mystics and magics. Of course, many who held this view were not entirely familiar with voodoo and traditional African beliefs, and were likely to embellish the practice to serve their own agenda, citing it as evil, corrupt, or otherwise blasphemous. But this didn't stop Laveau and many of her clientele from practicing voodoo. In fact, Laveau herself would learn most of her craft from a voodoo doctor in New Orleans, who was simply and rather insidiously known as Dr. John. What separates Louisiana voodoo from voodoo and other forms of voodoo is the Catholic influence that people like Laveau infused with it. Louisiana voodoo would incorporate holy water, incense, statues of saints, and even consisted of Christian prayers, thus making it more acceptable to the upper class and more appealing to those who were devout to Christianity. A lot of Laveau's beliefs included spiritual forces, as is common in all voodoo, whereby the spirits which are summoned can be either benign or mischievous. The idea was that these spirits connected with the followers of voodoo, guiding them, imparting some form of divine knowledge, or simply bringing good vibes.
Get close to the words of the prophets. God is in there. Moses told his people to put scripture in little boxes and tie it to their heads. Strap the Bible to your forehead. Shout proverbs from the rooftops. Post parables on your mirror and on your wall. Pack your margins with notes. Sing the Psalms as your prayers. Read Paul out loud like poetry. Know Isaiah by heart. Love Matthew like a brother. Squeeze the verses like oranges. Do like the Lord told Ezekiel. Eat this scroll and fill your stomach with it. So I ate it, and it tasted as sweet as honey. Don't just read the words of the prophets. Eat them.
Vimeo has become part of Mighty Oak's everyday processes. We are using Vimeo links on.
How this was achieved was through a mixture of dance, music, singing, and even the use of snakes. In fact, Laveau herself was even said to have worn a pet snake around her neck, which was named Zombie. Some of Marie's notable services as the Voodoo Queen include the selling of gree-gree bags, an amulet originating from Africa that is said to bring fortune and protect the wearer from evil. The gree-gree bags were said to contain a variety of ingredients that were blessed by voodoo queens or voodoo doctors to bring the wearer a certain effect or destiny. Charms, magical powders, ailments, and desire-granting ornaments, including those that could destroy a customer's enemies, were also sold by Laveau. She would also conduct spiritual readings, telling fortunes, giving advice to those who sought it, and casting spells including cures, charms, or even curses for the right price. However, some historians believe that Laveau's feared powers were actually just clever acts, and that all of her divine knowledge about people's lives was merely acquired by the recording of many secrets that were spilled to her by her clients. Bearing in mind, she would be serving many prominent households in New Orleans, some of them likely to divulge certain sensitive information, given her warm and compassionate persona. It suggested that Laveau would use this information to further her own status, or would use this information to build the idea that she was indeed all knowledgeable. Another account has it that Laveau would use the black servants of rich whites to obtain information, and that she would do this by either instilling fear into the servants, threatening to curse or hex them, or simply pay them off. There is one story of Laveau's powers that would captivate all of New Orleans. Supposedly, a wealthy man's son was accused of a rape allegation and was set to face a long jail sentence. The evidence against the wealthy man's son was damning, and it looked to be an open and shut case. Desperate to ensure his son's freedom, and out of all options to achieve it, the wealthy man went to Laveau for aid. In exchange for her success in this matter, he would offer her a house. Laveau agreed and hosted a voodoo ritual where she underwent a form of self-torture. She placed 3 ridiculously hot guinea peppers in her mouth and held them there for hours as she appeased to the spirits. In voodoo, the belief is that the spirits take pity on those under great suffering, and so Laveau would use her pain to draw the spirits out and grant her what she sought.
We use a guinea pepper, hotter than Hades. When the gods see this willingness to suffer, to sacrifice, they pay attention.
On the day of the hearing, Laveau snuck into the courthouse and placed the guinea peppers that had been in her mouth under the seat of the judge. Some believe that the energy from the spiritually enhanced peppers caused the judge to set the wealthy man's son free. As was the agreement, the wealthy man would then grant Laveau the house he had promised her. However, some historians dispute this case, stating that if such an occurrence did in fact take place, then it's likely that Laveau would have known the judge through her social circles, or would at least known something incriminating about the judge for which she would have used to blackmail him with. Of course, she would have still used her voodoo theatrics to convince New Orleans that she did indeed possess magical powers, but some believe that the basis of her powers was merely political manipulation and intimidation.
If somebody wanted to do an investigation into Christianity, where would you?
When Laveau passed away in 1881, she was said to have died with a smile on her face. Reporters of the time referred to her not as a sinister practitioner of dark magic, but as the kindest woman who ever lived, a saintly figure who nursed the sick and spread compassion amongst the diseased and the condemned. Laveau is buried in St. Louis Cemetery, in the Laveau-Glapion family crypt. The burials are in vaults above ground, where Laveau's tomb attracts many visitors, even to this day. Many slabs in the area, including Laveau's own tomb, are marked by visitors with an X symbol. The idea stems from a decades-old rumor that Laveau would grant wishes from beyond the grave if an X was marked on her tomb. Supposedly, the ritual goes something along the lines of marking an X on the tomb, turning around 3 times, knocking on the tomb, and then yelling out your wish. Should the wish come true, then the wisher would need to come back, circle their X so others would know of Laveau's power, and then leave the voodoo queen an offering. One of Laveau's daughters, also named Marie Laveau, was said to carry on her mother's mantle after her death. By some accounts, she was the splitting image of her mother, though what she had in looks, she lacked in her mother's spirit. Some have said that she did not possess the warmth and compassion of her mother, and was more inclined to inspire fear. One of her most notable talents was the ability to fulfill the desire of any man. She would hold lavish parties at Maison Blanche, a building for the congregation of blacks and whites in New Orleans, where women would dance naked for men, politicians, and high officials. Essentially, this building, amongst others, would become something of a brothel, but it was never raided by the police, who feared that if they intervened, Marie Laveau II would curse them. Some would say that Marie Laveau II drowned in a lake after a big storm. Ever since then, both Laveaus have sunk into obscurity. Marie Laveau continues to be a central figure of Louisiana voodoo, however, and of New Orleans culture. It's said that gamblers even shout her name when throwing dice, or before big stakes. Additionally, there have been multiple tales of sightings of the Voodoo Queen, even to this day. And that wraps up the tale of Marie Laveau. But was she a powerful Voodoo Queen, capable of cures and curses, and contacting spirits? Or was she more of a political player, using a network of spies and her own cunning to enhance and embellish her abilities? You tell me in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video and hit the subscribe button. Our next occult legend comes from Jewish history, whereby a rabbi created a creature to protect other Jews, only to have it turn bloodthirsty.
You're not Julius Caesar, okay?
No, I'm not. You didn't think big enough.
What if you had the perfect life?
Mercedes-Benz SL65.
Will you marry me?
Of course. Julia Bernard, better known as Julia Brown, was born in Louisiana in 1845. Little information is available about her early life, as her story has primarily been passed down through oral history. Despite this, it's very probable that she had very little formal education, instead becoming accustomed to voodoo practices, which she was likely taught by her relatives. Around the 1860s, Julia lived in New Orleans. During this time, it's thought that she used her abilities to help people with illnesses. Her methods were similar to that of a traiteur or a faith healer. Back in the 19th century, there were many healers in Louisiana. These included healers belonging to the French-speaking Houma tribe, Cajun healers, and voodoos. The treatment used by traiteurs involved prayer, medical remedies, and laying hands on patients. These people were essential in Louisiana because of the lack of doctors and physicians in many rural areas. So, faith healers such as these took their place tending to the well-being of local populations. It is said that traiteurs would only perform treatments if they were asked. Moreover, their services were always free, as their healing abilities were considered a gift from God. As Julia got older, her voodoo abilities improved. Some sources even claim she was a priestess or queen. At some point during the 1860s, she left New Orleans, moving to a small settlement 25 miles to the west called Frenia. The village of La Frenia was named in honor of the Attorney General for Louisiana, who was called Nicolas Chauvin de La Frenia. The first settlers had arrived in La Frenia back in 1850, and as time passed, the community grew and the village's name changed to just Frenia. Here, Julia served as a midwife and healer for the town's small population, using her knowledge and whatever materials she had at her disposal, mainly herbs and natural remedies. During the mid-19th century, many German immigrant cabbage farmers moved to the three small towns on the southwest edge of Lake Pontchartrain. These were Ruddock, Frenia, and Napton. Before long, these communities became prosperous, self-reliant logging towns, relying heavily on the cypress tree. Despite the three communities growing in size, with new people settling there, the infrastructure was poor. There were no roads, no electricity, and no doctors. All they had was a nearby railroad which delivered them goods and supplies from New Orleans and exported their logs, cabbages, and lettuce. As strong winds were common in these areas, the settlers made sure to build sturdy homes, which were built 8 feet off the ground to deal with rising waters. Census records tell us that in the year 1880, Julia married a man called Celestin Brown. Not much is known about Julia's husband, except that he worked as a laborer in Frenia. Julia remained in Frenia for the rest of her life, occasionally traveling to the larger neighboring town of Ruddock to treat locals. In these towns, especially in Frenia, Julia was heavily relied on. Yet, despite her importance in the community, many of the townsfolk took her for granted, only turning to her when they were in need. Some sources claim that she was well liked by the locals, but at the same time, it has been noted that many avoided her. Aunt Julia Brown, as she became known to the locals, supposedly lived at the edge of a swamp away from the rest of the village. Furthermore, rumors existed about her being a voodoo priestess who practiced dark magic. According to the local legend, she also became known as Julie White or Julia Black. Records tell us that Julia Brown's husband was given land by the federal government in the 1900s. In total, they owned 40 acres, which was used for farming. Sadly, in 1914, Celestin Brown passed away. There was no mention of the couple having any children, so Julia likely inherited the plot of land after his death. Aunt Julia Brown was known to sing songs that she invented on her front porch while playing the guitar. Usually, these were fairly normal melodies, but one day, she began to sing some especially troublesome lyrics. a local woman called Helen Schlosser Berg stated that the words to this new song said that one day she would die and everything would die with her. This eerie song was very disturbing for local residents, making it very unforgettable. As the tale goes, in the months leading up to her death, locals would frequently hear Aunt Julia Brown sing, "One day I'm going to die and take the whole town with me." The exact words of this lyric varies. According to an article from 1972, what she actually said was, "Oh, when I die, I'll take half of Frenia with me." Some locals interpreted this ominous song as a curse, although originally only some locals suspected her of being a voodoo. Following the events of her death, everyone believed it. Aunt Julia Brown passed away on the 28th of September 1915, aged around 70. Her funeral took place the following day and was attended by the entire town. Also, as she was well liked, some people came even as far as New Orleans to mourn her death. Yet, some of the townsfolk attended for other reasons. It's thought that some were fearful of a premonition and hoped that this would ease her spirit. Others, meanwhile, went out of guilt for how they treated her in life. In any case, it made no difference. On the 2nd of October 1915, the New Orleans Times published an article which described the events of Brown's funeral. Many pranks were played by wind and tide. People had gathered for miles around to attend the funeral of Aunt Julia Brown, an old lady who was well known in that section and was a big property owner. The funeral was scheduled, and Aunt Julia had been placed in her casket, and the casket in turn had been placed in the customary wooden box and sealed. At 4 o'clock, however, the storm had become so violent that everybody left the house in a stampede, abandoning the corpse. The corpse was found Thursday, and so was the wooden box, but the casket never has been found. The Category 4 storm that struck during the funeral service seemed to have come out of nowhere. It later became known as the New Orleans hurricane of 1915. Evidently, those in Frenia had no idea that a hurricane was about to hit the town. However, this was mainly due to the settlement's isolation and because they never usually received any newspapers. In the larger town of Ruddock, the train that passed on the morning of the 29th of September threw off a newspaper which stated the likelihood of a hurricane. Despite this warning, it made almost no difference. The harsh storm had winds of 125 miles an hour, and the storm surge made water levels in the local area rise by 13 feet. In Frenia, the locals had no time to get to safety. Some of the townsfolk managed to make it to the railroad depot, but sadly, it collapsed due to strong winds, resulting in the death of 25 people. Many faced an even worse fate, drowning in the Manchac swamp. One lucky survivor later recalled how he held onto a cypress tree for dear life, and how he tried to block out the screams of those dying in the swamp right next to him. Some families were lucky enough to get on the train which was headed for New Orleans, but it was forced to stop as the track was covered with debris. The survivors later noted that the only tracks left were those under the caboose. The storm devastated many communities in Louisiana as it swept through the state, but it completely wiped the towns of Frenia, Ruddock, and Napton off the map. The railway that connected them to the rest of the state had washed away, and virtually every building and house had been demolished. Once the storm subsided on the 1st of October, it was recorded that there were around 300 casualties in Louisiana, with 60 of them being in Frenia and Ruddock alone. Those who survived the hurricane in Frenia gathered the bodies of their deceased neighbors and buried them in a mass grave. As most of the village was consumed by the rising waters, The cemetery was located on the few bits of land still above the surface, right next to the Manchac Swamp. Years later, a sightseeing business placed makeshift fences and crosses all over the cemetery. Julia Brown had a separate grave from those who lost their lives in the storm. It was around 100 yards apart from everyone else. Today, all that remains of Frenia is the cemetery. To this day, legend states that the Manchac Swamp remains haunted by the voodoo priestess Julia Brown. However, it's very likely that the life and legend of Julia Brown has been manipulated in order to increase tourism in the area. Manchac Swamp tour guides will tell the popular, more interesting tale that Julia Brown cursed the town, provoking the storm, yet some have different opinions. It has been stated by former locals that Julia was not a revengeful type and that she was well liked by the townsfolk. Nowadays, many people associate voodoo with black magic and curses, yet mainly it's to do with healing. Although it's impossible to know the exact truth, there's a chance that Brown's song was actually a warning to the townspeople about the storm that was about to hit. However, since her supposed warning was quite unclear and ominous, it's hard to believe that these were her true intentions. Thank you everyone for watching this video on
Talk to me nice, I get sensitive. Choice of your words to convey. Your intentions might mean the best, but it's in your approach and delivery. I get so through by my triggers, probably from niggas who thought that they owned me. Really consider that I do, you do, we do good on our own. Back on my throne, like yeah. Accept me at my worst, like you do my best. Better than I was last year. I've been facing tests, separate from the rest. Hope you're facing all your fears. I've been going so damn hard. It's been taking all this time. Giving up ain't in my blood. It's all in the signs. It's all in the signs. All in the signs. It's 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 all in the signs. I'm so nice, everybody's type. Eyes on the clock of my demise. To devolve into the quicksand. It's better on the cement. Telling no story, no power in your past. Even if you're 30, gotta make it last. I do, you do, we do good on our own. Back on my throne, like yeah. Accept me at my worst, like you do my best. Better than I was last year. I've been facing tests, separate from the rest. Hope you're facing all your fears. I've been going so damn hard. It's been taking all this time. Giving up ain't in my blood. It's all in the signs. It's all in the signs. All in the signs. It's all in the signs. It's all in the signs. All coming down. It's all in the signs. It's all in the signs.
talk to you today about what is going on in the world now. And it really has to do with Baba Luaye. We are in a pandemic now. And the Orisha that you hold, Ogun, you are Omo Ogun, you are beholden to clean yourself. Clean yourself well, because there will be those that are attracted to you. One of your roads is the healer. Make sure that you are clean first.
I need to cleanse, you need to cleanse, we need to cleanse. He need to cleanse, she need to cleanse, they need to cleanse. I need to cleanse, you need to cleanse, we need to cleanse. She need to cleanse, he need to cleanse, they need to cleanse. Da 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 da. Yeah, yeah, yeah. 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 Florida water, rose petals so divine. Dance for the ancestors, they bless us all the time. Burn out the sage, evil things are gone. We're living in a serious time, uncareful all you gone. I need to cleanse, you need to cleanse, we need to cleanse. He need to cleanse, she need to cleanse, they need to cleanse. I need to cleanse, you need to cleanse, we need to cleanse. She need to cleanse, he need to cleanse, they need to cleanse. Da 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 da. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Da 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 da. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Da 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 da. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Da 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 da. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Abedi kutu awaledi so. Abedi kutu awaledi so. De Baba, Baba Luaye. Oh, Baba Luaye. Oh, Baba Luaye. Baba Luaye. Abedi kutu awaledi so. Abedi kutu awaledi so. Oh, de Baba, Baba Luaye. Oh, Baba Luaye. Oh, Baba Luaye. Baba Luaye.
I remember the spiritual baths and the raw food fast. Looking at the man in the mirror, I was beautiful then. Time has come, it's time for a cleanse. Spiritual readings, Iri de Logun. Orishas are speaking, the foot of Ifa. I laid my sacrifice, tuning in. Claiming today is the first day of the rest of my life, and it's filled with blessings. Cleanse, you need to cleanse, we need to cleanse. You need to cleanse, you need to cleanse, they need to cleanse. I need to cleanse, you need to cleanse, we need to cleanse. She need to cleanse, he need to cleanse, they need to cleanse.